of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist, Tony Stewart.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to welcome you to part 3 in a 3-part series of programs with the Department of Political Science at Washington State University. On this third program, we're very happy to welcome to our program Professor Paul Hagner, who holds a baccalaureate degree from the University of Michigan and a master's degree and PhD degree from Indiana University. On the faculty at Washington State University, he's a specialist, as he was in his PhD program, in political behavior, the media, and methodology. At one time, Dr. Hagner was also a writer with the Night Writer newspaper chain in Washington, D.C. He is with us today to discuss particularly the role of the media in its relationship to government and how they work with one another. Dr. Hagner, it's a very special pleasure to welcome you to our program.
Thank you.
I would like to welcome back the 2 panel members that have been with us for the past 2 weeks in our series with Washington State. First of all is Mary Lou Reed, holding a baccalaureate from Mills College and did her graduate work at Columbia University. Once again, welcome, Lou.
Thank you very much, Tony.
And I would like to welcome back a sophomore pre-law student at North Idaho College, Rich Cook. Rich, welcome once again.
Thanks, Tony.
We'll proceed to questions from Lou Reed.
Yes, Dr. Hagner, let's start out immediately with your charge that the media is manipulated by the government, and subsequently so is the public. You use this in a speech that you have given using the analogy of the hippo and the tick bird. I don't know if you want to go into the hippo and the tick bird, but why do you feel the media is manipulated by the government?
Well, we tend to look at the power of the media and think that that power is being used either for the benefit of the public or at least it's controlled by the media themselves. That is no longer the case. It could have been the case back in the 60s when politicians themselves were media naive. They are no longer media naive. They are now extremely confident in terms of projecting a given image to the to be covered by the media. The better crafted, better packaged that image, the more likely, the higher probability it will be that what they have packaged will actually go across the air as news, when in fact it's really not news, it's simply a PR program. The famous hippopotamus and tick bird analogy, which is not original, I'm not sure exactly where I picked it up, was to illustrate what is the symbiotic relationship between the media and politics. Symbiotic relationship is where you have 2 organisms living off of each other for mutual benefit. Hippopotamus lies there in the gook and has gaps between his teeth where he gets food stuck. He doesn't have a toothpick, but the tick bird comes along and picks out the crud between the hippopotamus' teeth, and therefore gets a safe food supply, and the hippopotamus gets clean teeth. And so, not stretching the analogy too far, the argument can be made that the press acts like the tick bird, picking out the crud between politicians' teeth.
They just do not have enough money, enough staff to go out and find all the news that there is. And so they're really dependent upon being supplied to some degree, or it's just that they're being fed.
It all depends what, there is an enormous news hole, especially with newspapers. But whatever, there's also the economic advantage of having news packaged for you, so that little editing is required. It's something which is snappy, and it's also something which is, and this is the bottom line, entertaining. We tend to forget that media enterprises, except for nice systems like PBS, are dependent for their income on selling an audience to an advertiser. You attract an audience, and then you sell it to an advertiser. So there is no guarantee nor expectation that it should be quality programming. It's like going to your local food store and saying, why do you serve Why do you sell this stuff with all these artificial ingredients, this junk, Twinkies, etc.? And the food store manager would look at you like you were crazy. He says, people buy it. I'm not in the business to provide them quality food. I'm simply in the business to provide them food. Entertainment's the same way. Television's the same way. They're not there to provide quality programming. They're there to attract an audience, to sell to advertisers, to keep in business. Else they'd go out of business. They go bankrupt.
But basically, then, the media have been getting the bad press and being blamed for having as much influence as they have when actually they're being influenced.
Well,
that's the conclusion of your...
Well, the conclusion is that that bad press thing is part of the manipulation. That it's very nice for the politicians to say that the media gave them a bad shot, gave them a bad image. It's very nice. The media's a nice kicking boy for it, or a kicking person, I guess. And the fact is that's part of the whole manipulation, that the media can't defend itself. It's in no way able to do that. And so the politicians basically can have it both ways, manipulate and at the same time say that they are being manipulated.
Rich Cook.
Yes, Dr. Hagner, you mentioned that people must get their information from more than just one source, preferably several sources, to avoid being taken in by media's pseudo-events and biases. What combination of sources should the average American seek out in order to avoid these obstacles to media accuracy?
Well, one alternative would be to select news magazines with competing points of view. Say the New Republic and Nations, or a left orientation and a right orientation, right being in terms of conservative. What this would mean is that where they agree on points of fact, you can probably say that that is fact. Where they disagree, you can probably identify the ideological slant between them. In politics, as in religion, there's no right or wrong. It's simply how you view it, what your ethical, political beliefs are. So you really have to get at least a couple of points of view. You can't go to Time and to Newsweek and expect different editorial points of view. They're also written on about the 11th grade level. So that is denaturing. It's like saying I'm informed because I watch ABC News and then I switch to CBS News. That's you get simply more of the same. So you have to go to sources which have identifiable biases. Perhaps even the Spokesman Review and the Lewiston Tribune, for instance, which have two editorial policies, two news selection policies, to try to get to triangulate on the truth. Don't watch television if you want to be informed. That's my other point. Television doesn't inform.
We hope this program is an exception, especially during your appearance.
Whoops.
I would like to ask you a question concerning what a presidential candidate told me one time. Early in a campaign for the presidency, there were a lot of candidates, and they're hungry for publicity and news events that they can appear on. And this particular candidate told me that if he discussed the issues in great depth or seriousness, that he would not make the nightly news. However, if he would ride a turtle in a parade, as he did, that would make the national news. So whose fault is this? This certainly, in this case, would not be the candidate's fault. Would it be what the media would put on, or is it what the American people will listen to or look at? What I'm trying to say is, do we blame the citizenry itself for not being more willing to take more serious issues?
That's a difficult question. It's a chicken and egg question. Did the tolerance for stuff like that create the audience or vice versa? I would say that's a socialization process. People are used to only looking at things like that. They're used to getting information that way. And once that's been programmed, then that's all that they can accept. A good example of that, which doesn't relate to politics, but I think is very telling. You have to remember that research on the media and media effects really has only been going on for 10, 15 years. And you need longitudinal studies. You need looking at the same people over time. And the illustration I wanted to make was Sesame Street. In its first 3 or 4 years, they tested the reading skills of Sesame Street youngsters. And they found out that they were going up much higher, much quicker than kids who were not watching Sesame Street. Well, then they plugged more money into Sesame Street, etc. Now they're finding out that the non-Sesame Street kids are actually starting to drop in reading skills, while the Sesame Street kids are now going down in reading skills and achievement skills, while the non-Sesame Street kids are going up. And the reason is that when kids get to the third, fourth, and fifth grade, they're going to encounter subjects which can't easily be taught by Big Bird or Count Chocula or whatever his name is. Sesame Street combines learning and entertainment. And when learning is disassociated from entertainment, kids are now turning off. This is one of those subliminal effects. So in answer to your question, people are so used to having news entertain them that it will continue unless there's some way to break that pattern. And the only way to break that pattern would be have some government intervention in terms of supplying news access over private television. But then that gets into lots of things which are not really fashionable during the current regime. So I can't answer the question. I think they've grown together and reinforced each other.
Thank you. Lou Reed.
Well, you've just put me in a very difficult position because I do remember that turtle, and it was a wonderful Galapagos turtle, and I don't, that's a bad example, how you pick on the turtle. And Big Bird, of course, is one of my really favorite television characters. So this is hard. It's sort of like, yes, Virginia, there is or there isn't a Santa Claus.
Yes, I'm not going to get into that.
Yes, you have said, Dr. Hagner, that television doesn't inform. Could you say a little bit more about that? And although that's an elaboration on what you just said. And then earlier you said that you think the information level of the American public is so low and that this is tied in with television. Could you go on about that a bit?
Okay.
Without any more, aspersions to.
I'll try not to dump on Big Bird anymore. Yes, well, Walter Cronkite himself, the Lord High of television news, said television news doesn't inform. It's a headline service. It tells you, okay, here's the news, and it reads the headlines, and then it gets out. You're dealing with 22 minutes of programming, and that's it. And 1/4 of that is human affairs. Now I'll pick on the turtle. I mean, it has people writing turtles and things like that. So we're dealing with maybe 15 minutes of headline news, and that's it. The total amount of verbal communication on a network news would fill 3/4 of one column in the New York Times. And so there's not too much going on there. So that's fairly obvious. The second part of your question in terms of information levels is less obvious, but it's even more disturbing to me at least. What's going on is that like in 1960, we had much fewer levels of access to communication. So the electronic marketplace has exploded. I'm not talking about space invaders. I'm just talking about information access. But the fact is that the reading levels have gone down in the last 20 years, not up. And they are correlated with heavy television watching. And the fact is, in order to communicate a story without having to spend a lot of time going into history, you have to communicate using stereotypes. Stereotypes being rough capsulizations of what's gone on using broad generalizations, like giving the Iranian crisis. The Iranian students were called a mob repeatedly because it fixed that in the people's mind. I've never heard of a mob that lasted a month in such an organized way. It doesn't fit in with what I think of as a mob. You never saw any network news coverage of the stability of the Iranian family during that time because it simply would not fit in with the stereotype. Once the people form stereotypic views of something, it's very hard to break that down. One of the best examples of that, and this is reaching into, for what for a lot of people is prehistory, the Attica prison riots in the beginning of the 70s. The people inside the prison were being held captive by the actual inmates. Anyway, Rockefeller sent in the National Guard. The first news that came out was that the hostages had their throats cut. That went on all three network news. It appeared in Newsweek and Time, etc. It turned out that the hostages had been shot by their rescuers, all of them. But what has been retained, in fact, sometimes there was not even a reversal of that, was the original story. So once the stereotype has gone out, It's very hard to change that stereotype.
This
again.
has something to do with the nature of television itself, right? In that it carries graphic images, and,
Yes.
so that even though you aren't seeing something like blood, if somebody's talking about it, it becomes a lot more personal. Is it true that people trust television, the information they get from television, more than any other
Television
medium?
is used more than any other medium for information and is most highly trusted.
And what is that? Does that again have something to do with the nature of the personal, intuitive? If we can see it, we can believe it.
That's part of it, and the other part is simply more human than that. People don't read newspapers, and they simply say, "I trust what I see. I trust what I use."
I trust my own judgment.
Yeah. Well, they say that, okay, I only use television to get news. So, and then they ask, what do you trust most? Well, they're not going to say newspapers. They're going to say television because that's the only information source they use. So I think it's the case that they're heavily dependent on television. So since they have nothing to reverse that dependency, they say they trust it. They say it's a trustworthy medium. It's cognitive dissonance. They refuse to believe that they are being manipulated by the thing they use all the time.
Tony, let me toss in just one quick
Yes,
follow-up. Are you encouraged at all? Do you see any light or hope in the public's craving for more news and the Ted Turner? Do you see any better journalism coming through in the all-news television stations? Is there some attempt to get away from the shallowness and the stereotypical?
You know, when I watch television news, I watch the cable news, and they're able to treat more things in depth. The stories they do in depth are much better, but they don't do that many of them. What they simply do is have more camera shots and a little more verbal discussion of things that the normal television network does. What the normal television network does in 1 minute, cable news now does in 3. 3 minutes is still not enough to do justice to a story. You know, there are quality sources of news on television. McNeil-Lehrer, Washington Recon Review, but because people are not used to doing that, you're not going to have somebody, you know, a steel worker come home, plop down, say, "Marge, get me a beer," McNeil-Lehrer's on. That's not going to happen. They're going to go to Family Feud.
Rich Cook. You bring up an interesting point, Dr. Hagner, on trust in the media. If I understand you right, you're saying that the people tend to trust the media, and that perhaps the media betrays this trust.
The media doesn't. The media is simply an instrument. I don't look upon the people in the media as being in any way out to consciously manipulate. The media is being used as a tool. Let me give you an example on that. More and more events are being packaged to be portrayed in the media as news. Reagan, a couple of months ago with the Fort Wayne flooding, he helped on the sandbag line. Now, is it the case that they needed people and Reagan happened to be in the neighborhood? It seems rather strange that as soon as the camera is turned off, Reagan put on his jacket. The fact is that they are using the media to manipulate us. That the media is not manipulating us. It's like guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, somebody uses the media as a tool for manipulation.
What can the media do to be more wary of such sort of events that they may be able to present a more accurate
Well, in the
description?
case, I'll give you an example. They ought to be more honest about the fact when they are being manipulated. The media, I argue for a much more activist posture for the media to say that, look, the only reason Reagan did this was to look good on the nightly news. And the fact is that he did it for 2 minutes, and he tried to give the impression it was done for an hour, which is simply silly. The media simply has to be more forthright. It has to be more solidly behind its First Amendment rights and stop being pushed around and manipulated.
You have also indicated, Dr. Hagner, in one of the lectures that you gave, that only about 5% of all reporting is investigative reporting. I assume you're speaking of live media in this particular case.
No.
All media.
All media.
If this is the case, then they're relying very heavily upon already developed press releases and so forth. And I think you even gave that statistic that 7% of all news that we get is from stories that come from government press releases, almost word for word.
Well, somebody did a study of the Washington Post and the New York Times, 2 elite newspapers. 70% of what they do is rewritten press releases. What you get in the Spokesman Review and the Lewiston Tribune, it's higher.
So we're talking even a higher percentage.
Mm-hmm.
Then are you also indicating that if we are to know more as a population or citizenry, that there's going to have to be more time and personnel involved in the reporters going out on their own and investigating major stories, at least on the local level, the state level, and the national level, international?
Well, the largest problem is that the media organizations are very much tied to their sources. If you have time, I can talk
Yes.
about Watergate. Watergate has always been used by the media as showing its finest moment with Woodward and Bernstein. Well, the fact is that we have to remember the story about Watergate. The fact is that Woodward and Bernstein, the story they covered right before, well, Woodward covered right before Watergate, was the hearings on the Sewerage Commission in Washington, D.C., because they were Metro reporters, and they covered the Watergate break-in as a robbery, as a break-in. And it turned into something else, and they lobbied with Ben Bradley to stay on, and that was the most important decision made in the whole thing. Bradley said, okay, I'm going to give this story to you, not to the the normal Washington reporters. If he had given that story to the normal Washington reporters, they would have gone to their sources and asked them what this whole thing is about. They would have gone to their sources like Haldeman and Ehrlichman and Dean and Colson. They would have gone to the criminals themselves and asked what's going on. The criminals would have said, no, nothing, it's just a burglary. Because Woodward and Bernstein did not have those connections, they had to go into the underbelly of the story. In fact, Watergate happened because the normal news collecting apparatus broke down rather than it was its finest moment. The fact is that investigative reporters don't like to upset their sources because they'll be cut out. They'll be cut off. They also, in a smaller community, you don't want to be anti-business or be, look at price fixing in grocery stores, etc., because they're the ones who pay your salary. They're the ones who contribute most advertising bucks. So truth is not the highest premium we're dealing with here. It's really truth within a very narrow frame of reference.
Thank you. Lou Reed.
Can I shift gears here just a little bit to ask you about how you feel about polling and the increasing significance both in the use of polling by candidates, by the newspapers, and in general, this is becoming just very common practice. We hear every day about how Reagan's job performance is doing. Would you like to talk about the pros and cons? Is this a healthy thing? Or is it just
all
a reality?
depends whose health you're talking about. The polls tell us more and more how much people don't know about politics. There was a recent poll asking opinions on Reagan's cabinet. They asked opinions on James Watt, and 50% of the survey had never heard of him, for instance. I'll tell you the most dangerous thing is the use of polls which are unscientific and passing them off as scientific. The illustration I'll give, after the debate between Carter and Reagan, ABC News had a special poll where if you thought Reagan won, you'd call a number, a 900 number. If you thought Carter won, you'd call a 900 number. They found out it was 2 or 3 to 1, Reagan won. Well, the fact is that first, if you lived in a rural area, you had a better chance of getting at that number. People in urban areas had a less chance of getting in there. Second, you could vote as often as you wanted. Third, it cost you 50 cents.
To the people who could afford it.
So all the characteristics of the people who had the best opportunity of calling in were also those characteristics of people like Reagan. In other words, it was scientifically worthless. It did not measure anything at all. You could have 50,000 people calling in. That doesn't matter if there's a bias in the polls. The problem is that poll results are reported. We don't see the questions. We don't see the sampling scheme. But we believe the results. And the fact is you can generate garbage easily. I can give you poll results now which come from simply my own head. And if it's reported over the airwaves without an understanding of the scientific basis of polling, then it can be very dangerous, very dangerous. So I'm in favor of good polls. I don't see any problems there.
What do good polls do for us?
For us, you mean in terms of the public, what the public would get from polls? They don't read polls. I mean, I don't think the mass
Well, if they hear it on the radio, is there something to be gained by knowing that other people are agreeing with you?
Gee, I wouldn't know how to answer that. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. It would make them feel better if everybody did agree with them, but I don't think it would make them change their mind if they found out people didn't. They're useful in telling us, okay, the anti-abortion people right now. It turns out that the majority of people in the country are in favor of choice, which does take some of the wind out of the sails of the people who are pushing through the constitutional amendment in the Congress right now. So I think it's more useful for elites than the general public.
Thank you.
Rich Cook.
I don't want to get away from polling. I like to tie in the two subjects of polling and media. I'm going to assume that most people get the results of a poll through the media.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if the government, by its manipulation of the media, can determine what polls the people will see.
No, the government manipulation of the media is not control of the media. There's a difference. The government, one thing about polls is that the government cannot directly influence the results of a poll. What I was talking about in terms of governmental manipulation is staging events so that they look real and they're covered as news, like the presidential debates, for instance. They're simply press conferences, joint press conferences. They have nothing to do with news. Polls, on the other hand, the government does not step in and say, okay, that poll doesn't make Reagan look good, don't show it. Okay, that is nothing direct goes on like that. It's more subtle, and that's why we don't know we're being manipulated when it occurs. But the manipulation is definitely there.
Dr. Hegner, another issue that came up in the last campaign for the presidency, and it's even been discussed in Congress, and that is the time problem we have in this country between the East Coast and the West Coast. And with the modern media that we have, once the polls are closing in the East, there's 3 hours in the West for people to vote. Yet in an election that's not terribly close in the East, we forecast a winner, and in fact sometimes the loser is even conceded before the polls close in the West, and it might affect not that presidential election, but some state elections for governor and for members of the Congress. Do you see this as a problem, and if so, would you have a recommendation of how to correct the problem?
Well, in 1964, Goldwater conceded a lot earlier than Carter conceded. The scientific analysis of that shows it's mixed. Turnout drops off a little bit, but turnout within party doesn't seem to drop off. Well, there have been some alternative solutions made on that. We can't do like Canada does, which blacks out until the further provinces have been reported, simply because we don't have a state-controlled or at least regulated radio and television. You'll never get the private commercial media to shut up about the early reports. There's been a suggestion opening the polls early in the morning before the election for the West. The scientific studies have shown it really doesn't have that much impact.
I'm sorry to interrupt, we're out of time, and thank you so much for that answer. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Dr. Paul Hegner, and I would like, on behalf of our staff, to thank him for a very fine program, most informative, and express my appreciation to the panel. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-week series and will be with us again next week. Have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.